everyone. I'm Ed Fuller, the editor of the Trackside Photographer, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Talking Pictures. Our guest today is Michael Froio. For those of you who may not be familiar with Michael and his work, and you should be, he's a professional photographer who teaches at Drexel University in Philadelphia. He has published articles in the National Railway Historical Society and presented lectures to the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and various chapters of the National Railway Historical Society. Welcome, Michael. I've been looking forward to our talk.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Before we start looking at your work, I wanted to get your thoughts on a couple of things. One of the things that I really appreciate about your work is that you tend to work in ongoing projects, and we're going to look at some of them today, but From the Mainline seems to be sort of the seminal work that to some extent informs all of the other things that you do. Could you tell us just briefly about the From the Mainline project, how it came about, and what has it meant to you in terms of your understanding of the railroad and the landscape?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the Mainline project is actually kind of the culmination of some of the other projects that I've done and that I have on my website. And, you know, it's really it represents a couple of things. One, my interest in sort of wanting to understand the landscape in the context of some sort of theme, and in this case, it's transportation. It's not just the railroads. It's the canals. It's how the landscape's been used and how we've changed it. And in the Mainline project's case, the impact that the Pennsylvania Railroad had on the landscape and how its legacy kind of continues.
This might be a good place to mention your work in the recently published book from the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, the Railroad and the Art of Place, an anthology. Mm-hmm. And see, I've got a copy of it here. I can show what this looks like if I can get it lined up here. There we go. And you have you got I don't know, 10 or 12 pages in there with work from the Mainline project. And one of the things that I've got a quote from you, I'm not sure where it came from, but you wrote at some time, it is about the beauty and the benign and unremarked place, challenging our perception of the natural landscape. And I think, and I know that was written well before the book was published, but I think it's a real good one-line summary of what the book is about, and I think it's also a good summary of what your work has been about.
Yeah, I believe that was from the statement for the Watershed project. Okay. And it's always been fascinating to me that outside the parameters of photography, we go by places and we look at landscapes that are not really defined as recreational or industrial or commercial or whatever, and we just kind of dismiss them. But when you take out that context and you look at those landscapes, they can be quite beautiful, even in sort of a rugged or sort of shoddy state, and minus all the environmental concerns that might be associated with a particular place, or the fact that you're in the shadow of an airport or an interstate or something like that. And that's always kind of fascinated me. The essay in the anthology book, The Outlaw Landscape, I think sums it up beautifully. It just really talks about this sort of undefined, unspectacular place that so many are drawn to. And the railroad landscape is certainly part of that.
Right. You're referring to the Michael Flanagan piece.
Yeah.
I'd mentioned before that one of the things that I appreciated about your work was the ongoing nature of it. And so many times as photographers, we get into the thing of the sort of single picture mode. We're looking for that one great, photo. And sure. I think it's very impressive how, when I look at your work, and I know I've only seen a small fraction of it, but when I look at your work, there's a remarkable consistency and connectivity between all of these different photos. And I think that's really what sets your work apart to a large degree.
Thank you.
So, Michael, the photo on the left here is from the Mainline project. Tell us about the other two projects that are represented by the two photos on the right.
So the upper right one is from a project called the Relic project, and that's got sort of an interesting backstory of how it came to be and where it kind of fell into place in my sort of, I guess, education as an observer and as a photographer. And then the Watershed project down below it started, kind of post-academic, when I graduated undergrad at Drexel 20 years ago. I started looking at the landscapes along the lower Delaware River and Bay, and actually that project continues, and it kind of manifests in different ways, but that area and that particular subject matter has always been near and dear to me, and it's kind of I can be out there in 30 minutes and in some places not see a soul for a day, and it's a very sort of great place to kind of sharpen the tools and disconnect and just kind of clear my mind. But yeah, so I mean, these projects, Relic, I kind of consider it's done. It served its purpose, and but the Watershed project, much like the Mainline project, they're ongoing.
Okay, this is from the Mainline project, and tell us a little bit about this. I really like the way the landscape is divided here by the railroad tracks running right up through the middle of it, and the sort of misty mountains. But tell us about this shot. And the other thing I'm curious about is, what was your vantage point here? That you're obviously up high. Were you on the ground, or this is not a drone shot, is it?
No, I haven't used a drone. In fact, this was shot with a large format view camera. So this is Tunnel Hill. This is the summit of the Pennsylvania Railroad main line over the Allegheny Mountains. And what you have going on here is the track directly underneath me is what they call the slide, and or at the time it was solely an eastbound main, and that was part of the New Portage Railroad. And then down below, if you kind of look off to the left there's a pair of tracks that peel off to the left, and those were the original Pennsylvania Railroad lines. So right underneath me is a tunnel, and once they hit those tunnels, they've crested the summit of the Allegheny Mountains. So what you're looking at is a view looking east of the Allegheny escarpment that the Pennsylvania Railroad had to, basically face and deal with, and that was ultimately what created the need for Horseshoe Curve. So this is kind of like the final eastbound ascent to the summit.
I know that one of the things that you're very interested in is the relationship of historical photos to modern day photos, not necessarily the then and now kind of thing, but
Right.
But I think that this photo interests me in the sense that it really is sort of timeless. I think just by looking at it, you'd be hard pressed to say. I guess if you were really familiar with the railroad right of ways and that, you would maybe know. But otherwise, I mean, just for me, when looking at it, it could have been taken in the 19th century.
Yeah. And I draw a lot of inspiration from, 19th century works, William Rao, especially, Frederick Gudekunst, and a couple others. They kind of handled the subject matter the same way. And, by default, their stuff is historical now because it's 120 years old or 130 years old or more. But there's always a dialogue between those photographers from the 19th century and my own work. And in some ways, where Rao and Gudekunst were specifically hired by the Pennsylvania Railroad, there's a dialogue that talks about, what's in the photographs versus the how they made the photographs or
Mhm.
formally composed the pictures,
Mhm.
or even dealt with light. And then, there's other people like Baldu and Marville and all these other photographers that, from Europe that were kind of doing similar things in the 1860s, that have nothing to do with the Pennsylvania Railroad, but really how to deal with the landscape and sort of almost in some ways like a kind of, the academic schools of painting where they're referencing history and landscape and all kinds of different stuff.
This photo is from the Watershed project, and
Mhm.
I guess one of the things that led me to pair these two together is the fact that we have a track running right up through the middle of the landscape. Um, tell us a little bit about this one.
So ironically, this was a railroad at one point,
Oh, okay.
many, many, many years ago. But that's not the intent of this photograph. The intent of the photograph is really um, to kind of point out how the shoreline of the Delaware Bay is changing, and this is an area called Bayside, down near Greenwich, New Jersey, and um, if you look carefully right at the horizon line, you can see the bay overtaking the road, and whenever there's a high tide, particularly if there's a tidal surge or a full moon, these roads go completely underwater. And it's kind of one of those things where I'm fascinated by the fact that this happens on a daily basis, but I'm also fascinated by the fact that like this is going to be gone one day. I mean, this is all going to be underwater sooner or later, and the road structure is going to break up. Access is going to be reduced. Um, so it's fascinating to me to kind of look at this stuff. There's been a couple times where I've uh, underestimated these tides because they come in fast and you can find yourself stuck out there real quick. So, but it's just it's one of those sort of quiet moments where you're out in nature, and here you have this structure. Before that, it was a railroad, and nature's just it's no case for what can be done to overtake it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that stands out in your work is your exploration of what goes on between man-made structures and the natural environment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of an age-old thing, right? You're always talking about man versus nature, and I guess the challenge is how to not hit people over the head with it, and
Hmm.
and talk about it, but not beat a drum and say, oh, the environment's doomed. This is
Right.
where nature's taking things back. It's not my intent. It's just sort of part of the observation.
And now back to from the main line. This is a
Mhm.
waiting room of a station. Where is this?
Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
But honestly, it could be anywhere. They use this similar design, and as far as I know, it was Baltimore, Trenton, Lancaster, Harrisburg. They all look fairly similar.
Mhm. Is
But
is
this
this
one,
station still being used as
oh
a
yeah,
railroad
yeah,
station?
hmm
Okay.
yep,
Okay.
yeah. It's
Interesting.
on that Keystone corridor between Harrisburg and Philadelphia.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like it's in remarkably good shape. You don't expect to
Hmm.
see, this is the kind of thing you sort of expect to see either repurposed or in some stage of neglect.
Yeah, yeah. Now this one was in good shape, and in fact, I think I was there um, to make a couple photographs of the main waiting room, which is behind me. Um, and they were in the process of doing work. They had scaffolding, so I was kind of like, yeah, this isn't working. Let's go take a look at the passenger bridge, because this basically spans the tracks where the
Mhm.
where the platforms drop down.
Mhm.
Um, and this was a much cleaner view.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's interesting how the treatment of public spaces has evolved over the past 100 or so years, isn't it? I mean, this is you wouldn't see a building like this being built today.
No, no. No, I mean, it's very different now.
Now, this is from the Relics project. Where is this? Where are we now?
So this structure is spectacular. This is Memorial Hall. So Memorial Hall is one of the last surviving buildings of the 1876 Centennial Exposition. And this is up in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. So, you know, the Relic project, it started with the Civic Auditorium, which was being torn down, which is that first photograph when you had that triptych set up. After that, I started looking for different structures to kind of continue the work. I had spent 3 months at the Civic Center, but this particular one, Memorial Hall, was being renovated to become the Police Touch Museum, which is a Philadelphia institution. It's been around for years. And they went from this fairly small location to this incredible structure, and did a remarkable job on the restoration. And this was early on. I mean, they were literally just starting to set up this this scaffolding to go all the way up to the ceiling. And you know, I think I had a day to work there, and I made probably about a dozen pictures. But this one, just, you know, it architecturally, it's not like correct, right? You know, it doesn't really tell us about the building, but it gives you a real sense of how powerful the space is, even in this sort of transitional state. I'll never forget seeing this in the ground glass. This was shot with an 8x10, and you know, it's just like, oh God, this is it. This is the one. And it, you know, and the guys they're trying to walk around me with these giant carts of like steel because they're still setting up the, you know, the scaffolds. But fortunately, it was such a long exposure, they don't even register in the picture.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I love the interplay of the light and the shadow here. It really evokes being there to me. You know, all of the shadows coming through, the dark, surrounded by all the darkness, I think works. It's just a really effective photo from that standpoint.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice that it's, you know, it's only lit by those windows in the foreground. There's nothing, or in the background, sorry, there's nothing else going on there. It's completely just available light. So, you know, all the detail that's kind of lurking in the shadows, and you know, it's just got a great bit of depth and mood in it.
Back to another photo from the Mainline project. This, from a compositional perspective, this photograph really intrigues me. You know, I assume this is like a railroad viaduct that we're looking under here.
Correct. Yeah, you've got two. You've got the more modern one, and then the earlier structure. And I'm drawing a blank. I'm judging by the stone. The front one is the more modern one. The back one is the older one. And they're only about maybe 15 years apart, but it was part of, you know, the Pennsylvania Railroad's low grade improvements in the late 1800s, where they were building this like freight superhighway. And you know, there was 0.2%, you know, grade that was too much for freight, so they built a brand new bridge right downstream, and you know, basically supplemented the other. But what I find interesting about, you know, or what I find necessary in situations like this is, how do you tell that story in a photograph, right? Without bogging it down, without, so my intent in this picture was to just kind of like give you that little, you know, that little clue back there that there's something else, there's something more. And you know, the way the road kind of curves around, it leads your eye back there. And you know, my students ever see this, they'll laugh, because I always talk about composition, and how composition, you know, your goal as an image maker is to hold the viewer's attention for as long as possible. So the way that road moves you through the arch and then back into the distance, and you know, there's like this little side story up in the top right corner, and the way the trees are working in the foreground. You know, you got to figure out a way to, the images have to work on their own without the text, right? So there's something evocative there, clearly there's a story. So, you know, if people are inclined, then they'll look into it more or read up on it more.
Yeah, I love the way the three arches play out here. You've got, you know, the main arch in the center there, framing up beautifully these trees in the road, and then
Mhm.
to the right, you've got this smaller arch that, you know, is also the same kind of thing, but it's echoed then in the far background
Yeah.
with the arch in the background. So the three arches and the rhythm of those three, I think, really make an interesting interplay that works really well in this photograph.
I think it's funny too, because, you know, that, so before I started using digital, you know, I always photographed in fairly neutral weather, right? Like no rain,
Mhm.
obviously no rain, no snow, no precipitate whatsoever. And yet with digital, which, you know, everybody would think the opposite. Oh, it's electronic, you don't want to get it wet. Like, this was great. I mean, it was in the middle of a sleet and snowstorm, and, you know, if you look carefully, you can see the slight motion blur of the snow moving. And it just, using digital gave me so many more opportunities to work with weather and really kind of push what I've done before,
Mhm.
you know, both in terms of occasionally including a train, but also, you know, getting out in the most miserable weather and making it work.
This is from the Relic project, and I guess we're sort of looking at the arches again here.
Hmm.
This is a really quite a different photograph, but I think that thematically it seems to me to be related to some degree to the one that we just looked at, in that you're exploring these shapes.
Yeah, this is up on oh, I think this is up on Lehigh Avenue, Lehigh and Germantown in Philadelphia, which is the intersection of these two streets. Germantown kind of meanders through North Philadelphia in a sort of northwesterly motion, whereas everything else is in a grid. And this neighborhood just has this beautiful um, set of buildings. It's kind of, you know, its business district is all intact. And this bank was just, I mean, it just struck me how, you know, that you've got this giant sort of cornice and the way the capitals resolve up at the top, and that arch, and it's almost kind of sparse down below. You know, you've got like these little, what sort of get reduced down to little rectangles. And, you know, the, I think for me, when I was looking at this, when I was composing this, um, it was those little details, like the countering between the door on the bottom left and the window on the upper right. You know, how that sort of vestibule, that odd, like triangular shaped vestibule, fits inside that arch, and just the weight of that I guess parapet wall or cornice up top, um, kind of holds together the top of the composition. Um, this is one of those tough decisions when you're a photographer, is how much is too much and how much is not enough. And, you know, I think I made 3 or 4 different photographs here, one horizontal, slightly wider, so you can see how it connected to the other structures below it, because it's almost like this sort of stepped, you know, rhythm that comes away. But it didn't work. This one just drove it home. And even the way that that little parking meter kind of has its own little personality there in the foreground. Um, you know, it's about those little details and the sort of balance and composition. It's a very formal photograph. You know, outside of outside of its context of the project, it's very much looking at, you know, the facade and the details and you know, the shapes and forms and how they kind of balance out.
Yeah, I think everything, all of the elements in the frame work so well together, and that's difficult to achieve in a photograph. Um, and so I think it really works well.
And I think it's funny because, you know, you talk about this, and I made this photograph probably 15 years ago, and you know, I haven't spent a lot of time with this work just because it's kind of, it's not an active project, but it's nice to come back and look at this stuff and kind of rehash what I was doing, because when you're putting that together in camera, it's there's just something that's firing. You're not consciously, I mean, you're subconsciously thinking about all those relationships,
Mhm.
but you're also thinking about the environment that you're in, and that you're carrying around a 50 pounds worth of gear, and you're trying not to hang too far out into the street and get clipped by a bus to make the picture.
Right.
So it's nice to be able to kind of regroup and get somebody else's observation. It's like, oh yeah, I never saw that before.
Yeah. 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 You're working here and excuse me, and these other photographs as well, I think really show a strong um, sense of intention and detail in each photograph. These aren't
Yeah.
snapshots by any means. These are all
No, no.
very, very, very intentional photographs.
Yeah. Yeah. When I moved from away from the view camera to the digital camera, it was it for me, it was a matter of just learning the process. And then once I had the process, sort of knew what the camera was capable of, I treated it the exact same way as a view camera. It goes on a tripod. I use live view instead of the viewfinder, so it feels like a ground glass. I use tilt shift lenses to control perspective.
Mhm.
Try not to do any of that stuff in post. I tried for a while to do it in post, and I hated it. I couldn't stand the way, I felt like I was cheating. It's
Right.
just not the way I work. So, it was a different tool, but still that very intentional, very critical sort of eye of detail for composition.
And one of the things that I noticed was, and you were talking about using the tilt shift lens, but I noticed how balanced the columns on the very far edge, the ones
Mhm.
that are sort of cut off there, but they
Yeah,
are, they're perfectly arranged. Number one, they're just um, perfectly balanced, and they're perfectly vertical.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, the first thing you do when you set up a view camera is you take a level to it. You make sure that horizontally it's level and vertically it's level, and then fuss around with it until you're square with the building. And then if you're not dead center on, you have to shift a little bit, start over again. And so it's funny, after doing that for 20 years, you get pretty quick at being able to know like where to drop the tripod and start
Mhm.
start getting things going. But yeah, those things are critical to me. That's my, for better or for worse, my critical eye.
Another photograph from the Mainline project, and
Hmm.
this one is perhaps a little more loosely composed, but yet um, it still has some very formal elements to it.
Hmm.
But it's a fairly moody um, kind of photograph, and I think it works really well. I was going to ask you, are we looking when we look through the trees here on the tour on the right hand side? Is there a waterway close by
On,
there? Or
yeah, so on the right, the railroad swings to the right. Immediately in the foreground is a bridge under it's crossing the Little Juniata River.
Mhm.
And this particular area down around Spruce Creek, which is on the Middle Division, east of Altoona, um, crosses the Little Juniata River something like 15 times in like 6 miles. And this was kind of one of those places where I've been dying to go to for years, and actually finally just hiked the entire thing, and got out there at dark, before first light, and just kind of had some ideas of where I wanted to be. But there's no street view out here. There's no reference of what you're going to get until you're out there. and these waves of fog just kept coming up the river. And I think I made like maybe 6 variations of this picture where like everything in the background along the tracks is gone, like it's just white. So, you know, I just kept waiting and waiting. And what I liked about this photograph is just, it's almost like a stop motion thing where the, you know, you get these layers of dissolve in the background along the right of way. And then, you know, again, the fact that you saw or had suspected that there was a waterway there, you know, that's the intention, right? This is, I'm not going to climb down and photograph every bridge, you know, much as I'd like to. So you have to come up with a creative way to be able to illustrate, you know, that sort of struggle between this river and the railroad. Because I mean, the railroad spent a lot of money to forge a path through here.
Yeah, I love the way the picture is framed on either side by the dark shapes, and then starting with the lighter tree there in the center of the frame and following the tracks on back as it sort of fades into the mist there. I think that works really well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. My dog just decided to join us.
Oh, he's got an Elizabethan collar there, I see.
Yeah. Yeah. He had a little tangle with the neighbor's dog.
Oh dear.
Didn't you, buddy? Come on. Come on. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. Oh, there you go. Sit with your sister. Go on. Sit down. So anyway, I'm sorry. Let's see if we can continue here. Finney, lay down.
Is there anything else you want to say about this one before we move on?
No, I mean, this is actually a fairly new photograph from back in September. And, you know, I think it ties in to, you know, well, number one, obviously the Mainline project is a long-term project, right? So like that particular image on the initial slide with Franklin Borough from East Conemaugh, you know, you're making photographs for 10, 15 years on a single project. And I don't want to say a single theme because I mean, there's a lot of the Mainline project casts a pretty wide net. But you know, there's always that challenge. How do you not make the same photograph over and over again? And you know, how do you tell that story in different ways? And you know, like I was saying about Spruce Creek, how do you tell that story that the railroad struggled with this area? And this is just, you know, one part of a multifaceted approach to, you know, one sort of build the vocabulary for the project and build the visuals for the project, and just come at it a different way, but also, you know, not make it so different that it doesn't tie together.
This is from the Watershed project, and I think that what ties this together in my mind anyway with the photo that we just looked at was the connection between the railroad and the earlier transportation system of canals and rivers that was used. So the waterways, I think, are very important in telling the railroad story.
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit more about this one.
Well, this particular image, this is actually Washington's Crossing. So, you know, if legend is correct, this is where Washington crossed the Delaware.
Okay.
And yeah, this was one of those sort of fleeting moments where I was trying to get somewhere else, and the fog was, I mean, it was pea soup. You couldn't see anything. And when I came, you know, I just kind of like, it's like, you know what, let me circle through the park real quick and see if there's anything there. And sure enough, it just like started to lift just enough to reveal this. And to me, you know, the photograph is like, in this picture, I imagine, you know, George Washington showing up like behind that, you know, behind that stand of trees out in the water. But it also, it talks to the history of the landscape and how critical this waterway was to, you know, canals and navigation, American history, you know, the Revolutionary War, and all kinds of important things that speak to our history as a country.
Tell us about this photo, Michael. This is from the Mainline project as well. And what are we looking at here?
So this is the train station in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. The trackside elevation of it. It's an interesting structure, and this is actually, there's a subway that goes underneath the mainline tracks and then comes up the platforms, which is what I'm on. And I just love how stocky it looks and how it sort of fits into the hillside. And then of course up on the hillside you've got the famous Johnstown inclined plane. So you know, it's a little play on transportation history, and it's a little bit of a nod to, I mean, there's a lot of photographs from Johnstown that I've made over the years, that are a nod to transportation and industrial history, and you know, the Johnstown flood, and so this was, you know, kind of part of that, but really that sort of play between sort of intermodal transportation, where you have this inclined plane operation running in the background, and you know, the station down in the valley below.
Now, what's the status of this building? Is it?
It's actually they're doing some work to it now. I think they're trying to turn it into a public space, which is, excuse me, which is great because you know, it's a spectacular structure, and the sad thing was, when I was there, I couldn't get into the waiting room, and the waiting room was like, you know, it had been sealed and locked up, and you know, I think somebody local in town owned it, and I wasn't there long enough. The station personnel from Amtrak were like, you know, they own this tire shop down the road or some sort of business down the road. He's like, go stop and talk to them, and they'll probably, you know, arrange for a time. And I was like, I'm only going to be here for a day. Like, I don't, you know, when I go, I'm just on the run when I'm shooting. So I never circled back, but I'd love to get in there and photograph that interior, because I mean, that whole structure there is the main waiting room. So it's this big, airy, beautifully, it's got like that herringbone brick with a vaulted ceiling. It's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see that in its restored condition. But here is a common story as well, Michael. It's I don't know what this building is, but it's sadly neglected, and I don't know what is its fate is going to be.
Well, this structure, so the Relic project is uniquely Philadelphia, right? It was 5 structures in Philadelphia, and then some exteriors as well. This particular structure is the Divine Lorraine, and the Lorraine apartment building was one of the first high-rise apartment buildings in Philadelphia, and I forget it. Without looking it up, it transitioned into a refuge, basically. Father Divine had this mission that, you know, you could stay there, you could get clean, you could find God, and you could, you know, as long as you abided by his rules, there were sort of no limits on how long you could stay there. And so, you know, this particular space, it's a U-shaped building with a light court down the middle that faces North Broad Street, around, I think, Fairmount. And the up on the 10th floor, on the north side, there was a chapel, and on the south side, this space was like a banquet hall. And you know, that's why it has the word God stenciled up in the top there, and there's all these really great little passages stenciled over the windows on either side. So this building had been sitting vacant for years, and it was bought and sold and bought and sold, and finally there was some forward momentum going on, and they actually opened the building up for salvage. They were going to gut the building and start over, and the exterior was protected, and the lobby interior was protected by local and state preservation laws. Everything else was fair game. So they harvested everything out of this space. I remember going back there. You can see up the right and left hand side where they've like punched holes in the floor. They harvested the wood floors. They harvested that cabinetry in the back. The last time I was in this building, it was a skeleton. This space rather, it was a skeleton. And fortunately I had made this photograph, processed the film, didn't like it, had the ability to go back. So I made this photograph 2 or 3 times because I was like just not straight enough, and not, like one of the edges was wrong, like you were talking about that photograph of the bank building. So it took a little finagling to get this one right, but it's gone. It's one of those spaces that it's somebody's luxury apartment now, which, I'm glad the building has been saved, but it's sad to see that such an incredible space is gone.
Yeah, that's one thing that's really sad about the American landscape in general, I think, is how many structures have been torn down or just neglected and rotted into oblivion.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. You can't preserve everything.
Sure.
But and in some ways, that's where I've come to find, like, all right, photography can serve as a means to document, right? Like the anthology book kind of does that.
Mhm.
People like David Plowden have made their whole lives, their life's work doing that kind
Right.
of stuff.
Right.
And for me, that's, I guess it helps me, kind of be at peace with the fact that you can't save everything. It's just not
Yeah.
practical.
The title of one of Plowden's books is The Vanishing Landscape.
Yep.
Another photo from the Mainline project, and this one has a train in it. And actually, Michael, that's a little unusual in your work. Tell us about this.
Well, yeah, you're right. My intent of the Mainline project is not about trains. It is about the railroad, but it's not about trains. It's about this sort of generational, kind of timeless piece of infrastructure that has lasted well beyond its creator, right? And so to me, trains they don't play a big part, because it's a corporate identity. It's smaller than the railroad itself, because the railroad has survived several generations of railroads. However, that being said, photograph like this, I think it speaks to the scale of what the railroad accomplished. And this is the western leg of Horseshoe Curve. We're looking across the reservoir, and it just goes to show that this is the landscape that they had to conquer. And the snow, the ice, the clouds, the sort of graphic nature really forces that sense of scale, and really kind of reduces the railroad's role in the grand scheme of the landscape. Makes them for me, it kind of contextualizes what these people probably thought when they looked across this gap, and thought, oh God, we're going to build a railroad here. Like this is where we have to do this. And yet there it is. It's still running.
This photo also, I think it also emphasizes, I don't know if you intended this or not, but it sort of emphasizes the resolutely horizontal nature of railroads.
Yes.
You've got a sort of an almost panoramic kind of composition here. So that was one of the things that struck me immediately when I looked at this photograph, is just, wow, look at how horizontal it is.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned that, because out of this entire conversation, and if you go through my website, you could probably count on one hand how many vertical photographs I've made,
Mhm.
at least for my own work. And I'm very much interested in how things play on the horizon line,
Mhm.
and that sort of wide open, whether or not the actual landscape is wide open like that. I'm interested in that sort of long play across the space. Verticals for me have always been kind of I don't know, they're difficult. I try to stay, even for commercial jobs. It's like, I know I need to make this vertical, but I really don't want to. I don't know what it is.
Well, speaking of those long horizontal spaces, that sort of leads us to our next photo, which is from the Watershed project. And
Yep.
actually, I just love this photograph, Mike. And I don't know where the gradation of the sky and
Mm,
the dark earth and these grasses or reeds or whatever they are, but
yeah.
and the rhythm of the composition. I just think this is a really outstanding photograph.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, this is one of those benign landscapes. These are ATV trails, back behind the Philadelphia International Airport, in like the Tinicum Range. And this landscape is used and abused. And I mean, there's probably a smoldering car behind me, and all kinds of trash. But man, when I saw this, just how this sort of resolved, and the contrast of down below where you have that darkened, that dark mud, and then
Mhm.
those lighter areas, and the way the bay grass sort of contrast, um, it worked out beautifully. It's like that soft overcast light, um, and again, like, this is something that I tell my students: you don't have to have something remarkable to make a remarkable photograph. It's about how you frame it. And by no means would I ever call any of my photographs remarkable, but like, it's one of those things where, um, you just take this ordinary, beat up, shoddy landscape and memorialize it, make it something that it's not, by removing all that context. That kind of theme, photographs like that are the ones that keep me doing this stuff. It's You can go to, um, a state park, you can go to a national park, you can even along the railroad. I mean, the Pennsylvania Railroad, or even go out west. The landscape is just unreal, right? In some places, it's just this beautiful, seemingly unspoiled landscape. But I like the underdogs, and that landscape is kind of an underdog. It's a place that people use. It's not defined as a park. It's not defined as a wildlife management area. It's just a void, and you know those voids need attention too.
And those voids tell a story.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Well, Michael, it's been a real pleasure, and I want to encourage
Thank
our
you.
viewers to learn more about you and your work by visiting your website. I'll put a link to that in the description down below.
Okay, great.
And I want to thank everyone for watching. Take care, and we will see you in the next episode of Talking Pictures.
Thanks, Ed. Take care.